So there are a few things that make a Zoom meeting run a lot smoother. So the first thing is to please keep your microphone muted during the presentation. Otherwise, what happens is the camera automatically goes to you instead of the presenter. So it's really incredibly disruptive. And plus, you just never know what's going to happen. We've seen dog fights, all kinds of things. If you can adjust the view of the speaker up in the upper right, there's a speaker view, gallery view. You can adjust that. Just click on it to toggle back and forth between. During the presentation, there will be 2 opportunities to have any questions answered, but it's again disruptive to have questions asked in the middle, and we're talking over each other and everything. So if you notice at the bottom of your screen, there will be a button that says chat. If you click on that, then at the box will, a sidebar on the right will pop up, and at the bottom of that, you can type in your questions. And then halfway through, and then at the end, then Bernie will be answering those questions. Also, you can chat between people. You can send a private message, but be aware when you send, make sure it says who you're sending it to, because the default is everyone, and not everything you want going out there to everyone. Okay, so I am going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Jerry.
Okay, cool. Well, welcome everyone. I think we're up to about 50 or 60 people now. Probably more people than we get in a real meeting. This is all wild and new. This is my very first time on Zoom. I'm not really a technophile, so this is all scary and dangerous for me. But it looks like it's working well. And Bernie was scheduled to give a talk in June. Clear back last year, we had this meeting scheduled. So I'm really, really glad that we were able to get it going. And Bernie agreed to do it on Zoom, and Amy has the expertise to get this up and running for us. So Bernie's going to talk about the Warner and Swasey Company, which is the telescope manufacturer that did the hardware for a lot of the great observatories of the 19th and 20th century. Bernie has the advantage of being a professional astronomer. He has actually worked on many of these telescopes and has seen them in action and gathered data through them. And he has some stories to tell. We have no business to conduct tonight other than Bernie's talk. So I think I'm just going to hit the mute button here and turn it over to Bernie. Bernie Bopp, give it a welcome.
Thank you, Jerry. Let me sort of do my sort of, yeah, okay, just a minute while I sort of readjust things on, yeah, there we go, good, on my screen. So the title of my presentation, you can see there, and really this is a kind of part of a triptych, I guess. I gave a presentation back in July about the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 meeting, and that was that in turn sort of led to another presentation that was back in February about the lunar ranging projects and that I've worked on, and some of the strange things that happened during our attempts to acquire the array that had been left on the moon by the Apollo astronauts. And while putting both of those presentations together, I realized that there was a kind of a commonality among telescopes, because one of the telescopes that I talked about in February was the 82-inch telescope at McDonald Observatory, which I've done a lot of work on when I was a graduate student. And that was a telescope that was made by the Warner and Swasey Company, a company that you may not have heard of before. I asked Jerry about whether he'd ever heard of Warner and Swasey before, and he admitted that he had not. But they built the great refractors and the first great reflectors. They were a real driving force in observational astronomy and telescope building. I think it's important to tell their story. The only downside of it is that it has a kind of a sad ending to it. in that the Warner and Swasey Company did not. It died, and it died in a sort of what I consider a very sad way. Now, Warner and Swasey were two machinists who sort of started off in Connecticut, I believe, but then decided to move west. They wanted to form their own firm, and they considered moving to Chicago. And this, of course, is in the last part of the 19th century. But they decided that Chicago was too far away and probably didn't have the skilled technicians that they needed. So they formed the company in Cleveland, Ohio, and it was there for its entire 100-year existence. So the Warner and Swasey Company built over 30 telescopes. They didn't sell their telescopes to individuals, but rather to universities and, as we'll see, to observatories. And they made some very great, large, wonderful telescopes. Here's the company. Here's the factory from a kind of a well, sort of a daguerreotype, perhaps, from the sort of very early days of the 20th century. And this is the company. The building still exists, vacant now, in Cleveland. It's been up for more than 100 years. But they started the firm, and it became very large. Here's the floor, and what they made was machine tools. And as Ambrose Swasey said in the quote on the top, we get our money out of machinery. That's where they made their money, and our glory out of telescopes. They didn't make any money off the telescopes, and they admitted that, but it was wonderful public relations for them. They were both actually very avid amateur astronomers, so it was important to them. They didn't make any money off of their telescopes, but they certainly earned the glory. So it was a Fortune 500 company by the 1960s. Both Warner and Swasey sort of died in the 1930s, but the company was strong and vital and doing very, very well. This particular photograph was probably taken in the 1940s, maybe a little earlier than that. And you can see many, many, many lathes, not just lathes that are being used, but lathes that are under construction. We'll get to that in just a moment. And here's here's a view of the building in Cleveland. There's the front part over there on the left. You can see it, but we can actually blow it up a little bit for a little bit of a closer look here. So there we go. There's what it looks like. And on the top, it says Warner and Swasey turret lathes. So what Warner and Swasey really were famous for and made their money on were what are called turret lathes. That was a phrase that I didn't know, or a term that I didn't know before putting this talk together. But there's a turret lathe. And what a turret lathe is, I guess it's an early form of mechanized manufacture. I mean, a lathe, most lathes that I've seen, you put in a particular cutting or boring tool into it, and then when you finish using that, you put another tool in and change the settings and then go on with the work. What you can do with a turret lathe, and the turret is apparently this gadget over here, is you can put multiple tools on a turret that might have 6 or 8 different faces. And then you perform an operation with one tool and then just rotate the turret and be immediately ready to perform an operation with another tool and speed up manufacturing. In the course of its lifetime, Warner and Swasey made over 70,000 of these turret lathes. Turret lathes were they were the tools that made the tools, and in fact, very important during the Second World War. They didn't manufacture munitions, but they manufactured the machines that made the munitions for the U.S. Army and Air Force. The refractors, well, the refractors are noteworthy. The U.S. Naval Observatory refractor is a 26-inch refractor. Let's blow it up a little bit here. This is from a 1904 photograph, and if you look carefully, you can make out Warner and Swasey on the plaque over here. They've got a big 26-inch refractor. This was the refractor that was used by Asaph Hall to discover the moons of Mars. That was in the 1870s. Now, that particular telescope that he used to discover the moons of Mars, it wasn't the Warner and Swasey telescope. They were actually contracted to build a replacement for the existing telescope, which went into operation in the 1890s. But again, a big scope. And yes, they made bigger, but also more importantly, they made beautiful telescopes. They made wonderful refractors that are an absolute joy to look at today. This one at Mount Wilson in California, dating from the 1880s, in other words, only a few years after the firmament started. 6.5-inch lens and a what is called a portable refractor with an adjustable polar axis, so that it could be adjusted for different latitudes, thus carried to different places on the Earth. I'm not sure for what, for different observing, maybe to observe different eclipses, perhaps. I don't really know, but it was now it's permanently at Mount Wilson, still used for public observing. But again, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship and workmanship. I also wanted to show you this. Look at the mechanism over here by which they rotate the dome. There's a sort of a toothed gear over here, and the dome, you turn the crank and the dome rotates. But they may have built the dome, I'm not sure. They did a lot of dome manufacture too, but they certainly built the telescope. Careful, they did not build the optics. They were not an optics firm, but again, many of the optics for their large refractors were done by Alvin Clark and Sons, by Bergier, the great lens manufacturers of the late 19th and early 20th century. And again, another absolutely beautiful telescope at Cornell University, built in around 1920, Bergier Optics, a 12-inch refractor, a thing of great beauty. Let's sort of appreciate it even more. Let's blow it up and take a closer look at it. And it's gorgeous. It's a wonderful design. All of the Warner and Swasey refractor designs look pretty much the same. Once they found a good design, they stuck with it. They expanded or contracted depending on the diameter of the lens, but they look pretty much the same, and they're just beautiful. I think they're works of art, certainly works of engineering art, if you will. And there is, and deserves to be, a Warner and Swasey Observatory. The Warner and Swasey Observatory nowadays has been transferred down to Kitt Peak. The telescopes that they built for that particular observatory, at least most of them, are down in Arizona, at or near Kitt Peak. But they didn't start off there. Remember, they're a Cleveland, Ohio manufacturing firm, so they actually started with this telescope. This is a 9.5-inch refractor. It was originally part of Warner and Swasey's private observatory, the observatory that they used as amateurs. They donated this telescope to Case University, now Case Western Reserve University, in 1919. And I looked at this telescope, when I was gathering the photographs, and was very startled to realize that it was very, very familiar looking to me. And it turns out that I recognized the telescope itself, the way it was put together, the focus arrangement over here, I think there's a coarse focus here and a fine focus over here. These are clamps in right ascension and declination. I recognized all of this, and I realized that there is a telescope down in the University of Texas in Austin, where I did my graduate studies, that's up on the roof of the former physics and astronomy building, still used today for public observing. And this telescope, so there's twins of these. There's a 9.5-inch refractor that is part of an observatory now on the Case Western Reserve campus, still used for public observing, but there is a twin of this telescope in Austin, still used for public observing there. And I actually operated that telescope and, sort of hosted the public, showed them, I'm sure, the same kind of things that EAS shows people at their public observing sessions. Planets, the moon, and it was great fun and an absolutely glorious Grendel instrument. Now, originally, though, this 9.5-inch refractor was located at the Warner and Swasey Observatory that was, for a long time, located east of Cleveland, which you can probably guess was not a great place for observing. But here's the building, and it says Warner and Swasey Observatory, Case School of Applied Science. And here's the dome. It could have been, it has greenish color. I wonder if it's a copper dome. Could be. But this was originally the building that the Warner and Swasey had their private observatory. They donated this to Case, again, in the year 1919. Now, the sad story is that this, of course, was a long time ago, and astronomers don't use refractors very much for observing, certainly not for taking data. In professional astronomy, the whole game is about light gathering ability. So this particular location for Case Western Reserve University fell into disrepair, and I will sadly, show you what it looks like today. And there it is. It's it's a derelict. And from all reports that I can read, still looks like this. Periodically, people wonder if it could be, purchased and then renovated or refurbished or something like that. There are no telescopes there right now, but the dome and the building is just, completely overgrown and basically a relic of an earlier and more glorious time. But Warner and Swasey were the builders, the contractors for the two largest refractors in the world, the Lick Observatory 36-inch, the Yerkes Observatory 40-inch, which we'll get to in a few moments, and glory days for observational astronomy, glory days for refractors in astronomy. They don't come any bigger and better than that. Here's a kind of an early drawing, I guess, of the 36-inch refractor, which became operational in 1888. Alvin Clark and Sons did the optics for it. The dome, the telescope, again, not the optics, obviously, but the dome and telescope, all of this was Warner and Swasey Company. And note that they're putting together, they're manufacturing this refractor, which at the time would be the largest refractor in the world, soon to be superseded by the one at Yerkes. And the firm had only been in existence for a few years, so they were trusted enough to be tasked with this very important mission. And Lick Observatory, this sounds strange to say, but Lick was the world's first permanently occupied mountaintop observatory. Now, of course, nowadays we'd say, well, of course. I mean, if you're going to be building an observatory any place on the ground, you would certainly put it on top of a mountain. There are so many good reasons for that. You're probably far away from city lights. You have less atmosphere to contend with. The seeing will likely be better. There are many, many reasons to put observatory on mountaintops. But in the 19th century, that usually wasn't done. The observatories like U.S. Naval Observatory, basically something at sea level. The observatories at Yerkes Observatory, again, basically at sea level. All of the other observatories were built sort of close to cities, which not bright as that, not anywhere near as bright as they are today. But the idea of building an observatory on a mountaintop is unusual. Here's what Lick Observatory on top of Mount Hamilton in California looked like just at the end of the 19th century. And here's the dome of the 40-inch over here. There's a smaller telescope that's in that dome. I know what's in it today. I don't know what was in the dome back in 1890 or thereabouts. It looks like there's snow on the ground over here. Mount Hamilton is not terribly high. It's about, I think, about 4,000, 4,500 feet or so. And by the way, down in the lower left-hand corner are the mules, which were part of the mule teams were what took people, astronomers, visitors. I don't think they got many visitors, but it took astronomers up and down the mountain to the Lick Observatory telescopes because well, motorized vehicles were either non-existent or simply not reliable enough to make it up to the top. Here's a more modern picture of Mount Hamilton today. We'll blow it up and take a look at it. Here's the 40-inch dome over here. This is the dome. The big dome is the dome for the 120-inch reflector. There are several other domes. There are a lot of it, more than half a dozen telescopes on top of Mount Hamilton today. And if you look in the background, we'll say more about this, but look over here, and you can say, wait, what are those things? Those are houses. San Jose is far too close to Lick Observatory. It is becoming problematic in terms of light pollution that's been happening over the past few decades. We'll talk more of this, but it's an issue for the future of Lick Observatory. And I threw this photograph in, and we'll blow it up just because it's beautiful. It's a beautiful shot. Here, this is the 120-inch refractor over here. Notice the crescent moon over here. And here's the 40-inch refractor in its dome. So not quite ready for observations that night. It looks like it'll be a nice clear night, but a little too early to start observations. So the lights are still on in the dome. But anyway, a gorgeous photo, I thought. So this is from half of a stereograph image of the back end, the business end, if you will, of the Lick Observatory refractor at the end of the 19th century. And I want to point out that not only did Warner and Swasey Company build the telescope and build the dome and the pier on which it stands, but they also had to do all of the engineering to allow it to be allowed to be moved around. I'm sure that these steering wheels over here part of them are clamps, I'm sure, or either fine adjustment screws for making small changes in right ascension or declination. And notice that there's a lot of them. I can count at least half a dozen of these. All of that was Warner and Swasey, and Warner and Swasey had to do the engineering that allowed a telescope, a large refractor, to be moved and shifted and fine adjusted from a distance of many feet away. This gadget over here, I'm making an educated guess. There's certainly an eyepiece there, but it looks like there's a micrometer screw here too. This could well be what's called a filar micrometer, which is used to measure separations and position angles of double stars. A lot of research with refractors at the 19th century were on double stars and the orbits of double stars. So that might well be what this is. I'm not positive of that, but it's kind of an educated guess, I suppose. A modern day photograph of the 36th century refractor. They've done away with many of the mechanical clamps. I'm sure those have been replaced by solenoid-driven clamps and electrical switches. But again, a gorgeous looking instrument. I mean, hand it to Warner and Swasey. They built wonderful telescopes, but they also built beautiful telescopes too. And this is the telescope that all the Lick visitors want to see. There are a lot of people that come up to visit Lick Observatory, as you might imagine. But the telescope that the visitors want to see is the 36-inch refractor. The 120-inch reflector is the bigger telescope, and yeah, people can see that from a visitor's gallery. But the one that they really want to look at is the Lick Observatory 36-inch, and I can't blame them. I have not been up to Lick Observatory. I've never seen these telescopes or used those telescopes, but that would be certainly the one that I would want to see. I would want to photograph. And I remember this being told as a graduate student and being joked about as a graduate student. Did you know, people would say to me, that Lick himself is buried under the pier of the 36-inch refractor? Yes, he is. And in fact, the plaque says, "Here lies the body of James Lick, who donated something like $70,000, which would be many millions of dollars today, to have the telescope built. I believe he died before the telescope became operational." And yes, here he is, interred below the pier of the 36-inch refractor. I don't think he haunts the telescope. I have not heard that. Okay, here's a modern picture of the 36-inch refractor dome. There's a 36-inch telescope over here too, a more modern scope that was put in, gosh, a few decades ago, and it's a 36-inch reflecting telescope, obviously much smaller in size, smaller in dimensions than the 36-inch refractor. And this is the original administration building that was put in. In its heyday, a few years ago, Lick Observatory had lots of people living on top of the mountain. In fact, there was a permanent staff there at least in the 1960s, that included 38 families. They even had a schoolhouse for the children up on top of the mountain. The number of resident staff has been dramatically decreased since that time, and in addition, the school no longer operates. So operations at Lick Observatory are contracting right now. We'll talk about another reason for that contraction too. Well, and here's the problem. The problem is, and let's blow up the map to take a look at it. Here's Lick Observatory, and here is San Jose. Now, the population of San Jose is 1 million people. And of course, when Lick Observatory was established at the end of the 19th century, I don't know how big San Jose was, but I would guess probably a few thousand people. But today, over 1 million people. And from Lick Observatory to pretty much the center of San Jose is 25 miles. So light pollution is becoming a very, very serious problem. I point out the road up to the last few miles of the road, Highway 130, I guess, up to Lick Observatory, supposedly has 365 turns in it. So getting up to the top of the mountain can be tricky. No, you can understand why mule teams were needed to get things up to the top of the mountain back in the day. But even driving up to Lick Observatory would be kind of a motoring challenge, I think, and I wouldn't want to take any kind of a van or large vehicle up to the top of the mountain myself. So yeah, there are problems, and the problems are being exacerbated by the fact that not too many years ago, about maybe 3 years ago, the state of California, which supports Lick Observatory through the university system, announced that they were they were going to be pulling support for the observatory, which might ultimately lead to its closure. So this is Lick Observatory could be, maybe I could categorize it as an endangered observatory. I don't know if this next picture shows a response to being an endangered observatory. But I found this at one of the Lick sites, one of the official Lick sites, and apparently, if one wants to, one can be married on top of Lick Observatory, and that's the 40-inch refractor telescope in the dome in the background. So, you know, I mean, if you want to have your wedding celebration, a destination wedding at Lick Observatory, one could do worse, I guess. Although it's not clear to me what all of the lights that they illustrated in this photograph, which is advertising for weddings at the top of Lick Observatory. Not clear to me what all of the lights in this illustration would do for observing. Maybe not too bad, who knows? But maybe, you know, if you have to make money to sort of save an observatory, and if this is the only way to do it, or one way to do it, then certainly go ahead. But you know, if I had to predict the future for Lick Observatory, I guess it will become a much more automated place. I suspect that, you know, there are several telescopes on top of Mount Hamilton that are already automated, fully automated. So I have the feeling that the 120-inch, which is the main research tool there, of course, would be the next to be fully automated and either remotely operated from Santa Cruz, which UC Santa Cruz sort of runs Lick Observatory. It would either be remotely operated from Santa Cruz or just completely automated and sort of working on its own in a robotic fashion. By the way, at the last minute, the state of California said, okay, we've changed our minds. We're not going to pull the funding for Lick Observatory. So the funding for Lick is still there, but you know, it's still what I would consider an endangered species. And then the biggest refractor in the world was also built by the Warner and Swasey Company, the Yerkes Observatory 40-inch. Yerkes is referred to as the birthplace of modern astrophysics. It's owned and run by the University of Chicago. More of that in a few minutes. But here's the 40-inch refractor, which looks, you know, I admit, a lot like the 36-inch refractor at Lick. Again, once Warner and Swasey came up with a good design, they stuck with it. These were built very close together in time, so it's not surprising that they should have similar designs. In case you're wondering, nobody's buried under the pier of the 40-inch refractor at Yerkes Observatory, but Yerkes was the chap who donated the money to get the telescope and a good chunk of the observatory built. Here's the dome of the 40-inch refractor at Yerkes being worked on by Warner and Swasey people. And I want to particularly point out the incredible, wonderful architecture of the dome and of the buildings. I'll show you that on the next picture. Yerkes Observatory is not just a wonderful testament to Warner and Swasey and to refracting telescopes. It's also architecturally a real gem. I mean, look look at this. The inscription says Yerkes Observatory, University of Chicago, and there are these wonderful columns here, columns on the telescope dome. It's an architectural work of art, I think. Another thing to note is the grounds. The observatory grounds are actually quite large, and they are landscaped. The landscape design was by Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, if that name Olmsted seems a little familiar, Olmsted was the landscape designer who designed Central Park in New York City. Now, again, a masterpiece of architectural landscaping. And I suspect that Yerkes Observatory is another masterpiece as well. I've never been to Yerkes, never observed through it. That's not something that I'm familiar with, but I'd love to go up there and take a look, as I'm sure many of us would like. So the telescope was a marvel of its age, the largest refractor in the world, still more than 125 years after it was built, still the largest refractor in the world. It was exhibited at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, and they didn't put the lens in. Perhaps the lens wasn't finished, or maybe that was not such a good idea to have the lens be on exhibit as well as the telescope. Keep the lens as safe as possible. So it was exhibited as one of the great masterworks of American engineering at the 1893 World's Fair. And when Einstein visited, at the Yerkes Observatory, the birthplace of astrophysics, and of course, this was in 1921. 1919, of course, saw the solar eclipse that proved the validity of general relativity, and Einstein was world famous. And when he came to visit Yerkes in 1921, and of course, he's immediately recognizable. I do not know any of the other men or women in the picture. I'd have to look for some key to the photograph to establish that. But I did want to also point out the many women that are exhibited in the photograph, and there are, let's see, by my count, 4. Looks like it could be a woman back here. So there could be 8 women that are illustrated here, a large number. And the reason for that is that they played a very, very important part in the work of observatories at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, because they did a lot of the calculations, a lot of the computations, a lot of the record keeping for the observatory. These were not secretarial staff positions. These were positions that were of much greater importance and much greater value. They deserve to be highlighted. They deserve to be better known. They're just beginning to be recognized for their contribution to astronomy today, but they should never be overlooked. They were not the researchers, but they codified the research. They made the research in that sense possible. Modern photograph of the 40-inch refractor, optics by Alvin Clark and Sons. And you might be thinking, oh boy, wouldn't it be great? I'd love to imagine going up to Yerkes Observatory, visiting the observatory, seeing the 40-inch refractor, maybe on a public observing night, looking through the 40-inch refractor. Who of us in the EAS would not look forward to something like that? Wouldn't we love to do that? Well, I'm sorry, you can't do it, because since 2018, Yerkes has been permanently closed. It's closed up, it's mothballed, nothing is happening up there. Now, admittedly, this is not, the Yerkes 40-inch is no longer research grade instrument in that it simply doesn't have the aperture. It's simply not suited for the kind of astronomical observations that are done by professional astronomers these days. But gee, did it have to be completely closed down? Well, okay, here we go. First of all, where is Yerkes? It's in Wisconsin, and you can't quite see Chicago on this map, but all of these are Chicago suburbs. It's about 100 miles north of Chicago. And, I don't think that the light pollution is terrible up there. It's very near the town of Williams Bay, and it is actually fronting on Lake Geneva, a lovely lake. And what did the University of Chicago decide in the year 2005? Well, the University of Chicago announced its plan in that year to sell Yerkes to a developer of luxury homes. Now, that hasn't happened yet, mostly because a lot of people, including a lot of amateurs and all of the inhabitants of Williams Bay, completely hit the roof. University of Chicago said, pragmatically and coldly, we have no use for Yerkes Observatory, so let's sell it. We're going to make some money off of it. And they could probably make a lot of money off selling that land, fronting on Lake Geneva, luxury homes. I mean, they could make many millions of dollars this way. Williams Bay, the inhabitants of Williams Bay hit the roof. They sort of saw big developments coming, and they did not react well to this. Amateur groups all over the country, all over the world, did not react well to it either. It's still sort of grinding its way through lawsuits and the court system. Its fate is still uncertain. Nobody knows what's going to happen to Lick Observatory. University of Chicago simply doesn't want it. They've washed their hands of it. And I don't know if I'll ever quite forgive the University of Chicago for doing that, for treating Yerkes Observatory that way. Is this an endangered observatory? You better believe it. I mean, it's possible that that University of Chicago could win lawsuits, and the whole thing would be, I can't imagine the observatory being bulldozed, but I can certainly imagine it, not being a shadow, a very faint shadow of its former self. So a very, very endangered observatory. Let's hope for the best here. And I promised to pause and answer any questions that might have come up. So let me do that. And Amy, you can sort of feed the questions to me, or I'm not sure exactly how we'll handle this, but we'll handle it. If people have questions, I'd be happy to pause now. I still have a couple of giant reflectors to talk about that Warner and Swasey built. So we're not finished, but we're at a good point to pause.
Well, for now, I just have two questions in the chat area. The first is from Steve, who wants to know about the telescope that was made for CASE. He wanted to know if he heard correctly and that it was made for them and then donated at no cost. Was that correct?
It was donated. It was donated to CASE. That's the that's the 12.5-inch refractor. Yeah, it was donated to CASE. It was originally at the East Cleveland location, that building that I showed you, the brick building, which is now completely overgrown and really decrepit. But it was actually moved to it's on campus now. It's on the rooftop of a building, of a physics building perhaps, and it's used for public observing. So it's being taken care of. It's not something that's been mothballed or allowed to gather dust. It's still being actively used, at least for public observing.
Thank you. That's very good to hear.
The other question was from, well, actually, we have three now. Mike says to notice that the telescope in the Warner and Swasey Observatory has a turret eyepiece.
Yes, it does. I saw that too, and I thought that was interesting. The telescope that the telescope that I mentioned that was on the rooftop of the observatory in Austin, Texas, did not have a turret eyepiece. I mean, that was just a single eyepiece. There are a selection of eyepieces, but there was only one that was used at a time.
And then Jerry asks if the 36-inch lens a singlet or a doublet? Do you know which one he's talking about?
It's yeah, at Yerkes, it's a doublet, certainly.
Really, that's way more impressive.
Yeah, yeah. I wish I had the specs for it, you know, how much does it weigh? You know, how thick is it? I don't. I didn't gather those numbers when I was putting the talk together, so.
Well, that's all we have for questions in the chat. This is fascinating.
I will press on and we'll talk about some giant reflectors.
Oh, one more comment from Larry that says it seems that Yerkes would qualify for historic preservation status, which is a good point.
I agree completely, and I certainly hope so. Like I said, the reaction of or the move by University of Chicago is unfortunate, cold, and it seemed you know, it seemed like, you know, we don't want it anymore, so we're gonna sell it to these other guys, and they can do with it whatever they want to do. Yeah, I certainly hope that it does qualify for such status, and I would argue that it does with great architecture, with great telescopes, with great landscaping. My God, if that doesn't qualify, I don't know what does.
And then Cheryl commented that it's been passed over to a community trust called the Yerkes Forward Foundation.
Yes, although that's right, but it's still up in the air exactly what'll happen, because the last word that my understanding of the last word from Yerkes, excuse me, from University of Chicago is that, oh, we have to get the Yerkes family involved in this. I don't know how many people Yerkes are left, but the Yerkes family needs to be the final arbiters of this, because I guess in the original agreement, it was the family had the final say in things. Now this is kind of scary because the family, I'm not sure how much the family cares about legacy or architectural masterpieces or optical masterpieces or whatever. So it's still very much up in the air. It's not a done deal yet.
And she added this interesting note that there were no ladders there for observing because they raised and lowered the floor rather than raising the astronomers up on ladders.
Yeah, I would imagine that a ladder would be pretty, you know, pretty kind of dangerous. Yeah, so the floor has to go up and down. I mean, that's not a not uncommon feature of many telescopes, but most of the telescopes that I'm talking about with adjustable floors are reflecting telescopes, so not a big deal. You know, you don't have to raise the floor up a lot to get up to the where the eyepiece or the instrumentation is.
Well, that's all the questions we have for now. So whenever you're ready, full speed ahead.
Press on. And Warner and Swasey, you know, didn't stop with great refractors. They went on to produce great reflecting telescopes too. In particular, one that is notable, and that one that we really could go and see, any of us could go and visit this, I think, is the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory 72-inch, which became operational in 1918. It's a Warner and Swasey telescope. They did the dome. They did the telescope itself. And DAO is just north of Victoria, British Columbia. I have to add the importance of DAO in my own lifetime. And ladies and gentlemen, if DAO did not exist, I would not be giving this talk. The reason is that on a sabbatical over 30 years ago, I was on a sabbatical at DAO. DAO was doing, at the time at least, the kind of astronomy that I was doing, that I was very interested in, again, at the time. And they had astronomers there that were on the staff of DAO that I knew and that I had worked with, and it was going to be a great sabbatical leave. And, the whole family, my wife and my two daughters and myself, our daughters were very young at the time, but we moved to Victoria, and we stayed there for not quite a year. And we fell in love at that time. We fell in love with the Pacific Northwest. It was the first time that we'd been out to this part of the country. And when it came time to retire 10 years ago, my wife and I asked each other the question, well, if you could go to any place in the world and retire, where would you go? And both of us said the Pacific Northwest because of that sabbatical leave in Victoria. And the DAO telescope, I used it. It's a wonderful telescope, a grand old telescope. And the observatory, it's not, it's on top of a mountain. There's a picture here that we can see. The mountain is not terribly high. It's about, as I recall, it's about 1,600 feet. So it's not a very tall mountain. It's north of Victoria, which has also grown quite a lot in the past 30 years, and obviously more than a century since the telescope went in. But so it's not an ideal site for observational astronomy, but it's still a very viable site, and the telescope is still actively being used. So we're not talking about an endangered observatory here. We're talking about something that's still astronomically very, very vital and very, very, very much in use. So there are two main telescopes here. One of them is the DAO 72 inch, also known as the Plaskett reflector. J.J. Plaskett was the astronomer, the director of the observatory when the telescope became operational. They named it. He was really the driving force behind getting the telescope there, and that is part of his legacy. Plaskett is one of those unique astronomers to have a star named after him. There aren't many stars that have astronomers' names attached to them. I can think of a few. Barnard star, very nearby, a nearby M dwarf with a very, very high proper motion, as I recall. And Barnard was a late 19th century astronomer who sort of first pointed this star out, discovered it, if you will. Let's see, I can think of other names. I can think of Kapteyn star, but I have no idea what Kapteyn star is interesting for. And then there's another one called von Manes star, and I'm sure I don't know what that is about either. There's another one called Przybylski star, named after a Polish astronomer, which has very unusual chemical characteristics. The elemental makeup of the star seems to be very unusual. And then there's Plaskett star, which is a very massive binary star system, which consists of two stars, two very, very hot stars, O or B type stars, that have about 50 solar masses each. And for many years, it was thought to be the most massive binary star known. I think it's been superseded by something else, but a Plaskett star is something that I learned about in my graduate student youth. This dome over here is a smaller dome with a smaller telescope, a 48-inch reflector that was not made by Warner and Swasey, but made much later. This was built, I think, in the 1960s by Grubb Parsons in England. Now, this is a significantly large telescope, especially for its time. This actually was the second largest telescope in the world until 1935, and it became superseded by the 74-inch. DDO is the David Dunlap Observatory outside Toronto. Another very endangered observatory, which is currently kind of mothballed, but I hope it makes a transition to a public sort of a science site that is again run by amateurs or a public citizens group. That is certainly what the city of Richmond Hill, a suburb of Toronto, would want. But the second largest telescope in the world was actually was hoped to be the largest telescope when they started the actual construction, which was in 1914. But obviously that was interrupted by by World War I, and the completion of the telescope took until after the war to complete. But the second largest telescope in the world until 1935. What does it look like? Here we go. Here's the image on the left is an older image, and the image on the right is a modern contemporary image. And you know, here you go. I mean, there are things that are obvious. We can sort of expand this a little bit, but you know, counterweight, polar axis over here. There's the right ascension. I'm not sure if the setting circles are still there. They may have actually removed those, but it was originally, you know, everything was done with setting circles. The telescope mirror is over here in the mirror cell, a finder telescope over here. And I think I could even make out some of those wheels of the type that we saw on the Lick and Yerkes refractors. Again, once Warner and Swasey came up with a good design, they stuck with it. So those are still around. They're not still around in today. This was a telescope, the DAO 72-inch was one which I used. There's a spectrograph down here attached to the modern picture, and I used that spectrograph for one very much like it to gather data when I was there on sabbatical. Here is an old photograph of the telescope, again with a spectrograph attached to it. There are two foci for this telescope. There is Cassegrain focus, which is used for spectroscopy. There is a Newtonian focus as well, which is used for imaging. While I was there, I never saw it being used for imaging, and I'm not sure how effective that would be given the fact that it's not a terribly dark sky site. So, you know, I'm not sure. I mean, the focus exists, but I'm not sure that it's really used for that purpose. And lastly, DAO is a Canadian National Heritage Site. It's not going to go away. It's still an active research center, but even if the research gradually moves to other telescopes or stops, it will be preserved. So very good news. Very good news. Again, not an endangered observatory. Nor is this one. I talked a little bit about the McDonald Observatory 82-inch reflector back in February, revealing two things. Number one, it was my very favorite telescope, and number two, that it might, or so I hope, be haunted by the ghost of Otto Struve. Could be, who knows? I kind of hope that it is. But here is the dome of the now called the Struve reflector, and this is actually the next three images that I'll show, or two images after this, are actually from postcards that were produced in the 1940s. So they're, you know, sort of original black and white photographs of the way the 82-inch used to look. It was not. It was a sort of an aluminum dome, and not something that was painted white like most telescopes are painted today. A titanium oxide white for temperature control purposes. No, this was an unpainted dome. It was first put in. Remember, McDonald Observatory was first run by the University of Chicago. The people that ran Yerkes, and Otto Struve worked for a long time up at Yerkes Observatory. In fact, I'm sure when he was observing at McDonald, but then when he went back to the Chicago area, I'm sure his office was at Yerkes Observatory and not down in Chicago, where the University of Chicago lives today. Yeah, and here's the telescope as it appeared, and it looked a lot like this when I arrived at McDonald Observatory in 1969 as a graduate student. Counterweight over here. Here's the polar axis. can't quite see the telescope, the primary mirror cell back over here. There's a right ascension circle, there's a declination circle. When I was there, when I arrived there in 1969, saying circles were still used on the 82-inch to point the scope. And you would point the telescope, you would then use the finder scope to do the fine positioning of it. You'd have a finder chart to make absolutely sure that you were on the right star that you were observing, and then take it from there. There are three foci for the 82-inch. There's a Cassegrain focus, of course. I used the telescope a lot at the Cassegrain focus. There is a Coude focus. We talked a little bit about that back in February when we were talking about the 107-inch telescope, but also at McDonald Observatory. And the Coude room is over here. The light path for the Coude focus would be down to the primary, back up to the secondary, and then reflected back, and then through the polar axis and down to a spectrographs, large spectrographs that would be at the Coude focus. And I use the Coude focus a lot too. And there is also a prime focus, but I never knew that anyone used it while I was there as a graduate student. It was either Cassegrain or Coude foci, but there's a prime focus too. I'm not sure if it's used today. It certainly was used in the past, but again, not something that's actively in use today. And here's a photograph again from the 1940s or thereabouts of the back end of the telescope. This particular instrument was there sort of on the dome floor of the 82-inch, but so kind of covered up with a tarpaulin or a piece of plastic when I was there. It was called the Struve spectrograph. This was the spectrograph that Struve used apparently to make many, many of his observations. A tireless observer. This spectrograph was kind of superseded by different instrumentation. It was no longer in use when I was there as a graduate student. But there's the primary mirror cell back over here, a couple of finder scopes over here. How big were the finder scopes? I don't know. They were like 6 inches, maybe 4 or 6 inches in diameter. There were refractors. This one looks a little smaller than that one over here. Here's the polar axis over here on the right. Oh yeah, this picture is a good one. This is the May 5th, 1939 dedication of the 82-inch, and there's lots of people here, and you will ask me how many people do I recognize? Well, I recognize 2 people. I can point out, and I will point out 2 people in this photograph, but these are astronomers from all over the world, and I've seen a chart of who they are, and they're the biggies in astronomy, literally from all over the world. People came to the dedication from Europe, from the Soviet Union. Yes, at the time was the Soviet Union. They came from the Far East. It was a worldwide gathering because indeed this was the second largest telescope in the world and would remain that way for the next 9 years. So the 2 people that I recognize, and you might be able to recognize at least one of them, is this chap right over here in the back, right underneath the letter D for McDonald. And that is none other than Edwin Hubble of the Hubble Space Telescope fame. He is there. And this is a harder one. I have to look at the key of attendees for this. But the person next to him, partially blocked, is actually the only woman in the photograph. She deserves mention because she is really one of the great 20th century astronomers. That is Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin was, she died, oh gosh, she got her PhD from Harvard Observatory around the year 1920 or so. It was the very first PhD given to a woman certainly by Harvard Physics and Astronomy, maybe I couldn't have been the first PhD ever, but certainly the first woman ever to get a doctorate in astronomy at Harvard. Peggy Goposhkin was a very incredible woman, an incredible astronomer. She was actually the person who was able to, as part of her dissertation, was able to determine the composition of the sun itself. And she said the sun is made up of mostly hydrogen and helium, which is correct and what we believe today, still true today. At the time, though, in 1920, that was not believed. It was believed that the composition of the sun was very similar to the composition of the Earth, which is not mostly hydrogen and helium, but it's mostly things like iron and oxygen and silicon and other stuff, the stuff you find in the ground. But Peggy Goposhkin was right, and again, she was a wonderful and wonderfully important astronomer. So what does it look like today? Here's the 82-inch sugar reflector in the present day, and things are a little bit different, but sort of subtly different. This room, I think I pointed this out to you. There's the polar axis again. There's a room over here that was newly constructed in the early 1970s. It's basically a warm room to hold electronics. I mean, when I came there were no real electronics to speak of, but now there are. Now everything is automated and computer controlled. Now the stairway over here, I think that was a stairway that was used for observers that might be observing at the prime focus. It's still there. So, it hasn't been, like I said, I don't think it's used at the prime focus anymore, or has been for decades, but the staircase is still there. I'm glad they preserved it at least. And the dome looks a little different today, but only because the railings are painted orange, and the dome is now painted titanium dioxide white for temperature control purposes. And then I like this, because this is actually something I didn't see. This was the new control panel for the telescope, which did not exist when I left the University of Texas, I believe in, let's see, I know that the last time I observed at the University of Texas was 1973, I guess. So this was not there. But here's the digital right ascension and declination readouts and, sort of telescope control. I sort of looked at this carefully. These are controls for the platform, up or down. A questioner was talking about that, raising or lowering the platforms, and then I had to look carefully to figure out what this was. And this is for the different motor speeds of the telescope. I don't know if there are 4 speeds, and astronomical telescopes that I've used tended to have 4 speeds. There were slew, search, set, and guide. Slew is the fastest speed, and guide was the, sort of like 1 arc second per second kind of motions. And then lastly, in the back, what's this gray thing over here? This is the tank that is used for reluminization. Every couple of years, they hoist the mirror out of the 82-inch primary, out of the telescope. They strip off the old coating, put it in the illuminization tank, pump out the air, and then blast a new coat of aluminum at the mirror and get back the 98 or 99% reflectivity. And the last sad story that I will conclude with is, how did Warner and Swasey die? It built, large and gray telescopes. Really, by the time, I think the last telescopes that Warner and Swasey manufactured were in the 1960s. They made close to 3 dozen total reflectors and refractors. And then what happened? Well, remember that this was 1880, they were founded. They were actually a partnership, and they stayed that way for about 20 years. Warner and Swasey were, they were close, they were good friends, they were fellow amateur astronomers, and they didn't incorporate the firm until 1900. And it persisted in the same location in Cleveland, Ohio, until 1980, when it was acquired by the Bendix Corporation. I remember the Bendix name, but the Bendix Corporation no longer exists. If you're old enough to remember, the 1980s was a time of frantic mergers and acquisitions, and a lot of companies just fell by the wayside. They were gobbled up by firms, which were in turn gobbled up by other firms, and then the company vanished or was sold off in pieces to pay corporate debt or something. I don't understand these things, but certainly a lot of that was happening in the 1980s. 1982, Allied Corporation merges with Bendix, and the Bendix name disappears. So Warner and Swasey, the name as a company, disappeared in 1980. And then the Bendix name disappeared a couple of years later. And then Allied Corporation sells the Warner and Swasey division to a firm called Cross and Trekker, which I admit I never heard of. They're a machine tool firm up in Michigan. I don't know if they're still around. I don't know if they still exist. But that was basically the end of it for not just for the company. The company was gone by 1980, but the Cleveland plant was shut down. Everybody lost their jobs. So it was, and that particular plant is still there, but it's been vacant for gosh, the past, do the numbers, 35 years. If I've got that right, so it's been. Here's what it looks like, and this is a photo that's very close to being contemporary. That's not an old car over there. So this is probably from, maybe it's from the 2000s, I think. But here's what it looks like today, and you may recognize the building from the old photographs that I showed. Notice that the name Warner and Swasey and turret lathes are gone. All the building, all the windows are boarded up, but the building itself is still there. It's a big building with great structural bones. But what does it look like on the inside? Well, you probably guessed. Vacant of material and pretty decrepit. If I don't know, what more can I say? There may be one. The city of Cleveland owns the building, and they have tried very hard over the past couple of decades to sell it. No takers, but maybe not. They've actually put several $1 million into asbestos removal. Obviously, being built so long ago, was full of asbestos. And they did clean up the asbestos, at least. The interior is in bad shape, but the structure itself is very sound. Now, I did read an article that said that last month, in May of 2020, the building was acquired by a firm that says that they intend to convert it to middle and lower income housing. Let's see what happens. But that's the saga of Warner and Swasey. Let's remember Warner and Swasey Company for the wonderful things that they did, for the great refractors and the great reflectors that they built. Let's try if we could, ladies and gentlemen, to forget about this last slide, which is the sad story of Warner and Swasey. But it's nevertheless a great firm that made incredible contributions to astronomy in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that's all I have to say. I'll be happy to answer any additional questions that may have popped up.
Thank you, Bernie. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
The only question I have from chat is, it's actually not a question, just a comment from Steve, that Cecilia Payne's thesis covering the atmosphere of stars was used for the longest time by astronomy students.
Yes, because it is a classic piece. I mean, it's one of those things that was that's 100 years old, but it's one of those great papers that should be read like like a paper that, like Einstein's general relativity paper, or the wonderful paper, another paper by the two Burbages, Jeff and Margaret Burbage, Burbage, Fowler, and Hoyle, always referred to as B squared FH, where they talk about how the elements came to be, what nuclear processes inside stars produce the chemical elements. Another great paper. I remember reading that as a graduate student, even though that was a paper published in the early 1950s. And, 30 years down the road, or at least 20 years down the road, it was still very, very, very relevant and wonderfully written too.
There is one more question. When did Mr. Warner and Mr. Swasey die?
In the 1930s. They did not see the sad end of their company, fairly obviously. They both lived to good, they were both born in the 1840s sometime, so they both were in their 80s or 90s when they died. So they lived long, and I think we'll all agree, very, very productive and fruitful lives.
Oh, thank you, Bernie. Jerry, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think we don't have any business. We're going to have to get another program rigged up for next month. We'll have to figure out what that's going to be. But I think this obviously was such a success. I'm sure we'll do it again next month.
Did you want, I mean, since the talk is over, if anyone wants to unmute, it's in the bottom left corner there.
Here we are. I can see most of us now. Bye.
Yeah, I think the screen holds up to 30 people on one, and then you have to go to another. And at one point we had 51 people, so.
Very nice, very nice.
Wow. Yeah.
So thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to speak to the Eugene Astronomical Society. And hey, I'm a member of myself, so I believe in everything you guys do and everything that you stand for. So yeah, it's just wonderful to be able to give these talks. I thank you for inviting me to do this. It's a great honor to do it.
It's also very nice to see members of the other clubs here too.
Yeah,
Just
thanks
kind of
for inviting us too.
Yeah. Well, I am going to log out and jump in my car and go drive out and do some astronomy. So
Yeah, a good time to do astronomy.
yes, indeed. Thanks, Bernie, for the inspiration.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. It was fantastic.
Bernie.
Okay.
Really great speech. Or